Okay. Hi, welcome to NDE TV. I'm Peggy Robinson. Today's guest is Raymond Moody. And Raymond is a philosopher, psychiatrist, and physician who has written books over the years on near-death experiences and coined the phrase near-death experience. And 1975 was his first book, right? Life After Life, that started this all out for you. Okay. And we just want to get right into a story he was about to tell me. So Raymond, go right ahead.
Well, we were talking about you and I are both kind of addicted to moving around, right? And so to you, you experienced the horror that I contemplate with horror of hurting my foot. Okay, now in terms of these near-death experiences and the thing of life after death, I did not come from a religious background. I mean, my dad was kind of, when I was a kid, hostile to the notion because I guess his experiences in World War II as a medic must have been pretty grim, as I gather. And as I gather, for that reason, it was, religion was. So fortunately for me, I mean, my astronomy was my thing. And the idea of an afterlife just never occurred to me because I thought it was like I remember a Jack Benny movie my aunt took me to about it, but yeah, I thought it was just like a comic premise, like a premise of comedy shows. So the first that I woke up to, oh my God, this is a real question. Was literally when I was reading Plato's Republic at the age of 19, which caused me to be a philosophy major, which is about these near-death experiences. It culminates in this. And that was the first. And then I heard from my professor, the early philosophers thought about these things. Plato thought they indicated an afterlife. His rough contemporary Democritus, who, get this, had figured out just from the idea that a straight line has an infinite number of points, right? And the observation that two things can touch like that. Democritus just figured it out that therefore there had to be these tiny little bits that are too small for us to see that bounce around there. And he called those atoms. But now then once he made that just realization, then he said, well, just a minute here. You look at that statue over there. It's made of solid bronze. It's been there for like hundreds of years, we know, but look how smooth it is. See, but it called gradual attrition. It wore down, but as long as you stand there, you're not going to see a fleck come off of it, right? Or like when they saw the water going down the rock face and it makes a little rivulet. Well, you could stand there, you're never going to see a piece block, drift off, but still over the long-term effect. Or you put a towel down on the dry beach sand, what happens over time, you don't see, but it gets wet, right? So, just 1 minute. Car. Calling my dear son. This dog out there, I tell you, it's an arrivee. It was not a request. It just arrived. And so anyway, now Democritus wrote, he knew about these experiences too. This is about 2,300 years ago, right? But he said, well, yeah, these people look dead, but he said there's no such thing as a moment of death. And he said when they return, it's like they appear dead, but that on the atomic level is these tiny little biological activities going on that's too small for us to see. And isn't it interesting that 2,300 years ago, it's the same debate. Right now, they call it oxygen deprivation to the brain, right? But it's the same thing. Now, but I have thought with myself, I long ago knew that it wasn't oxygen deprivation to the brain because one of my best professors. When I went to medical school, I had already been investigating this, and my professors knew. And very early on, this wonderful professor approached me and said, "Dr. Moody, I've been wanting to talk to you about an experience I heard this fun, some mentation I had when I was resuscitating my mother." I just remember that word so neat. And so she talked about how, yeah, she's trying to resuscitate her mother, but when her mother died, I left my body. I looked down, I saw my mother's dead body. I appeared now, but now I see my mother in spirit form, she said over here. She says her goodbye, and she saw her mother recede into this tunnel and light, and relatives and friends for a moment who had died coming from the light, and then she came back to her body. So you see, that's not oxygen deprivation to the brain, but it's the same experience.
Has nothing to do with the brain, does it?
And now, and in the long term, it doesn't. No, Eben Alexander, and I had a conversation about this many times. And it's like the brain is a kind of fiction of consciousness. It's. I mean, but. So through my long process of trying to bat down every, uh, you know, uh, any possible other thing, or not to bat it down, but I mean, see, the way I have, to me, the reason I seek for what I do is I just love the fun of rational inquiry. And to have real fun at it, you've got to know, number one, the rules and principles of logic and reason. And then you've got to bear down and apply those reasoning, those principles as rigorously as you can to whatever the question, with no thought of what you want there to be. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you go that way, it just ends to craziness and rational ruin. The way to go about it is to think of every objection you can. See, because it's fun. I can't imagine that people who just want to, try to come up with some so-called reason or argument to think there's what they want to think, that there's an afterlife. They've got to be miserable, I would think, because it's like that can't be any fun. Because if you're fooling yourself, that's a knowledge. It's kind of like a unpleasant experience. It must be. So what I'm getting at is, so through this long process, going back to 1962, I finally came around to saying I give up because of my foot. and so I have a friend, and I hope you know him, Dr. Anthony Chicoria, who is a PhD in physiology and an MD degree, and a renowned orthopedic surgeon and professor of orthopedic surgery. I think it's at NYU. And so Anthony is as solid as a rock and just a super neat human being. And so in 1994, he was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning and had a cardiac arrest. A nurse was there and resuscitated him. But in the interim, he got out of his body. He went through this, as he characterized it, hyper-real experience. This is nothing like a dream or fantasy like this. Hyper-real. And seeing, he was at a family reunion at a resort center, could see people going around, but then coming back to this apparent reality we're in, had never before in his life been interested in music, but suddenly became fascinated by the piano. Then had this recurrent dream in which he was playing the same piece of music on a concert stage on the piano, and then learned how to transcribe music so he could create that piece. And started learning the piano, and now, in addition to being a renowned orthopedic surgeon, is also a concert pianist. Now, you and I and any realistic person knows that that scenario does not fit with the common sense consensus view of reality.
Yeah, it's
I
like
mean,
us
that's,
NDEs pick up something there and bring it back.
yeah, exactly. Now, I ask myself, see, in the horrible condition that I don't want to even talk about, that I were to, like you know, sadly and horribly, to injure my foot, which would prevent me from my addiction to the high you get from walking vigorously every day, and now to ease the stiffness of the joints in addition. But that would be to me a horror, and I would say, would I surrender my foot to Anthony Chicoria and his medical exam? Absolutely, yes. I could ask an equivalent question about my friend Evan Alexander, the neurosurgeon, who, when I had, surgery or whatever, when I go, yeah, sure. And I know and I hope uh, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, the emergency
Yes.
room doctor. Yes, and his experience in the operating room during the concurrently near-death experience of Jeff Olson.
Right.
Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll was conversing with the dead wife of Jeff Olson, who was having a near-death experience, you see. So, and I guess would I submit myself to the medical care of any of these gentlemen? Absolute, and I could go on with others, but yes. Now, their unanimous judgment from their experiences is that not only was what they experienced real, but it was more real than what you and I are going through now. And so in my intellectual process, I have to give up. I can't think my way out of that.
And a lot of
So,
examples you just give, I think, also speak to the power of love. Jeffrey Olson, the power of his love his wife had for their child. You got to go back and be there for
yeah,
Spencer. And,
yeah,
for the other man, I'm sure, the power of love, leaving with him as his mother went to heaven. And it
yeah.
seems like the equation science isn't putting in there. Science is the equation of love.
Well, you know something, I love science. And I can see the world from that point of view and so on. And I love it. Oh my God, astronomy was for me. I was hooked at age 7. Oh my God, looking through there. Number one, my insight was I will never know much of anything. I realized right away. But number two, and also that it was nonsense. Because as I'm sure you realize, like you think, well, how big is this? Well, your mind goes out to the wall, but this doesn't there have to be some on the other side? Yeah, but that doesn't make it sense either that it goes on and on, right? So I immediately realize that my consciousness, which is remarkable in itself and inexplicable, that I am conscious now in all this vastness, that that nonetheless I am just so fascinated and grateful for every little piece of knowledge I can pick up. And the best way to conduct yourself in that is to be as vigorous or as rigorous in your thinking as you can. And I know all the logical objections. I can quote you Hume, the great skeptical philosopher who influenced Einstein. Others are the greatest of the philosophical minds. And all of their objections I know and agree with. And at the same time, I say, taking all of that into account, that it is. And but at the same time, people are going to have to make their own determination about this, right? This is not something, and should not be something that anybody believes because of what I say, right? Or you say, or anybody in particular says. It's like you've got to just put all of this together in your mind. And it looks to me like it's the rational person has every reason to sort it out. It's wow, there is something after this.
It seems like the skeptics think, oh, the Christians, the religious people, they just want to believe in an afterlife, but they don't realize a lot of the NDE researchers are atheists. They're not trying to prove the afterlife. And if anything, maybe they're trying to prove reincarnation, or they're just scratching the surface trying to prove the existence of something. But I really don't think a lot of them I don't think that's their goal.
Hey, Peggy, thank you for that comment because that word skeptic. Okay, let me say this. I know probably a lot of people who are listening to us, and greetings, by the way, folks, and thank y'all so much for listening to this. But I can pretty much guess that a lot of the people listening to us have kind of been made to feel uncomfortable by people who claim to be, oh, I'm a skeptic about these things. Is that generally correct, you think?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, folks, listen, let me reach out to you as not a person who investigates near death experiences, but rather as a person who has had the great joy in my life of being a professor of the most fascinating series of events in history, which is Greek philosophy. Everything about the way we think in this civilization we live in came from these amazing 20 or so people who, beginning about 600 BCE, roughly, and including figures like Pythagoras and Plato and other names we know. But in addition, a host of other amazing characters, such as Parmenides, who worked at an oracle of the dead or similar institution, where he could go over to the other side. But during one of these trips, he was abducted, he said, by a goddess who sang him this song to take back, which is the first written out logical deduction. And what that was, it was the discovery of the notion of truth, namely that some things are the case, no matter what anybody thinks about it. The independence of the notion of truth, which is fundamental to logic. Now, according to the person who came up with it, it came here from the other side. Okay, so all of this stuff you see is tied so deeply into these origins that the end result of this is we can actually, and I'm happy to say this now, make this claim and stand ready to be refuted, and would happy to be refuted. But I think that the major difficulties which have held back the rational investigation into the afterlife for so long are now solved. And I mean, I know folks listening in, you're not going to be wanting to hear about A.J. Ayer or David Hume. And that's understandable because it's death in a way is a more pressing thing. But that these figures who the great thinkers of history, they are the ones who have solidified or told us exactly what the difficulties are. Okay. Now, apart from the people who formulated the real objections, there is a vicious cult of ning nongs, Peggy, that I call who call themselves the skeptics. But now the reason I'm saying this has nothing to do with near-death experiences is that I love teaching Greek philosophy. So when I get to the skeptics, who are a wonderful movement of Greek philosophy, then I have to undo all the damage that these so-called skeptics who don't know what their word means to my students' minds. See, so that's why I'm agitated about this, not about NDEs. But I think this will be very helpful to the listeners. And let me explain this. Aristotle is the person who codified the logic that we're all using right now as we think, because it was so efficient, it just got sank into the public consciousness, right? And so after Aristotle codified this logic, there was a philosopher named Pyrrho, Pyrrho. And he thought of it this way. He said, well, Aristotle's codified a logic for us. What a great accomplishment. We know how to do this now. And it's like that is we can take premises and we have a set of operations or like a machine where we can take the premises and we can generate a conclusion. Now you think of all that has come out of that, Pegi, in the in Western thought, right? And so, but Pyrrho said, and by the way, at this phase of time, philosophy was not just the intellectual pursuit. Yeah, up to Aristotle, they would have had no idea, but trying to say the separation of the intellectual quest from the spiritual quest was inconceivable to them. That didn't come out to, much later. But as this logico-spiritual exercise, Pyrrho said, what if we do all the logic right? We ask every question, we really bear down on it. But in the end, what we do is we refrain from drawing a conclusion. That, folks, is what it means. That's what it means. And the reason they did it was that, number one, it's absolutely mind expanding. I mean, I've sort of naturally done it all my life, and it really does put your mind at a weird place. I was a comedian for a while, and this was a two-track thing. I mean, the skeptical method can expand your mind in some very interesting ways. But also, if you think of it geometrically, and everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to avoid a conclusion, you see the side pathways, right, that everybody else missed. So that's what the skeptical method is all about. Now, feed that back to these ning-nongs who say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. What that statement translates to is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. That is a self-contradiction. Don't worry about those people who call themselves skeptics. They don't know what they're talking about. To put the proper label on it, they are humanists. And the society was founded by a wonderful man I loved, Paul Kurtz. But it is basically humanism, and it is a religion. I actually found out about humanism. I was trying to read into Erasmus and the folks back in the Renaissance and so on. I was trying to read about it. So I found a book about humanism, but no, this is a modern day cult. They have rejected religion because that's uncomfortable. God and all that's out the window. But they like the structure of the church. So they have like rituals and funerals and weddings and all, the whole bit, but it's without God is the point. And then they have these subsidiary ventures like the Skeptics Society, so on. But now I'm just telling this because people, listening to this, I'm sure have been assaulted by these people who don't know what they're talking about. So that's the end of my speech.
I watched again recently the debate that you and Eben did with to skeptics trying to prove the afterlife isn't real. And just the end of August, like August 28th, that one of those guys, Steven, somebody that was there in that debate, he put out a video on YouTube that said that he wants to challenge Dr. Jeffrey Long in a debate like you guys did 10 years ago. And and they were laughing at Dr. Jeffrey Long and calling him names. And I thought, how scientific is that? That you've already made up your mind. You have such prejudice before you even hear an argument.
Yeah. Well, there's a way out of this, but it's, the real problem. And by the way, we're talking about my new book, Proof of Life After Life. And I want to thank you for that. And in this new book, Paul Perry and I, who wrote it together, and thank you also to the folks at Simon and Schuster. I mean, I'm just so appreciative to these people who, helped me put out my books and so on. And I'm really happy to see this one out, because don't you think have you perceived, as I have during the last, especially post-COVID, that there is a great thirst for this?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it got people really thinking about how real death is, how close it could be. Because, everybody was felt like a sitting duck. Am I going to get COVID? Am I going to die next week? Everybody was faced with the mortality.
Yeah. I've studied epidemiology a little bit, and epidemiologically, when an event like the COVID thing happens, you can't really tell the number of people who died at that time. It has to be a number of years so you can get a perspective over a larger statistical run. And so that we hear that 1 million, but no, and that will be, as we get more data, that will rise. So you think of all the grieving people that have come from that. Yeah. And also a whole new, midlife for many people, especially who've been very successful, for example. And Plato observed this in the Republic. And he said that very successful people who've spent their whole life in their business and the workaday world, and very responsibly interacting and just really providing, and they come to this point about 50 or 60 or 70, that suddenly it's like, well, the way Plato pictures this is the very beginning of the Republic. This is a beautiful scene. This old guy, Cephalos, who's probably a young feller to me by now, but maybe 60, 70 or so. But Cephalos was very distinguished. So going down the hill to the harbor, Socrates, who's then about 20, runs into this old guy, Cephalos, and he says, Cephalos, what is life for you, like at your age, because I may get there someday. So Cephalos says, well, Socrates, I've done very well in my business. I made a lot of money. I'm passing wealth along to my kids, and just really spent my whole life focusing on that. But, like just recently, all those stories about the afterlife I heard about, I remember hearing about when I was a kid, are coming back to me. I've developed this sense of urgency. Well, Pegi, I don't know how many times I heard that from people who came to me for psychotherapy, and I bet you've heard it from people too. It's the question of life after death is a developmental question that naturally comes up at certain developmental marker times, like realizing your mortality, being given a terminal diagnosis, losing a loved one to death, or just arising, in many cases, from just curiosity. I'm sure you've observed too, as I have, that the older you get, the more friends your age have had some sort of experience of stepping over into another reality.
Yeah, because in our life, we're always looking ahead. I want to build a house, or I want to get this degree. I want to step up my game into this career, or want to pay off my house. All these things, all these goals. And then we get older and we're like, what's my goal now? Because all I see is the grave.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's like I give up. Like I said, I just think that there's so many things that add up. And all of these things Paul and I talk about in this book is one that, I mean, some of the things you see as a medical doctor who deals with the terminally ill are just so odd, I guess, by common sense standards that you sound disturbed when you're talking about it. But let me, for example, a recurrent thing when you work in a unit where a lot of people are dying, you go in one day and the family there with the terminally ill people that you've gotten to know over the weeks, and as grandma has gone down. And there one day you come in and they're also joyful. Grandma is woken back. She's back to her old self. Be able to take her home right now. And and what you realize is no, that's not grandma. That means that grandma is is kind of the courses like this of death.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
And
they become hyper. It's if you've seen it, they light up with a light. They tell a coherent message to everybody. They're in another world, is what happens.
like say people, think, well, you get a certain age or all they see is the grave. And if they think that's say it for them, like atheists that don't believe in afterlife, or just don't believe in afterlife for whatever reasons, or even the ones that do believe in afterlife, some just believe in reincarnation. They don't believe in heaven or God or wherever someone's belief is. I feel really fortunate being a Christian and having had NDEs to know that the grave isn't a stopping place. It's not even in existence because you leave your body and you're somewhere else. It's not a stop at all.
Peggy, it's like I talk to God every day. And it's just like people ask me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? And I say, no, absolutely not. Because number one, I, Raymond Moody, am a very limited human being. And any belief that I could formulate about God would be bound to be off base in some way or another. And secondly, when you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of that sentence, think about this, is on that word exist. Put a balance between it. Put one God on one side, exist on the other. Which is the heavier? See what I'm getting at? It's like, as a logician, it would take about an hour, but I could sort of basically outline some logical principles, and I could show you what it means in the statement to say that something exists. And I could even show you the symbols they use to express it.
So you
But
talk to God every day, but you don't believe
what?
he exists because you
Oh
have
no.
trouble with the word exists, right?
Well, it's more than that. It's like, think about it this way. It's like I say that I could show you what it means to say that the word exists, but when it comes to God, I give up. When somebody worries about whether God exists, and I've known and you've known people is their main attitude to God is arguing about whether God exists. But I say it's so, to me, exist as a human concept it's like trying to draw a circle around something. You can't draw a circle around God. To say that God exists doesn't make any more sense to say that God does not exist. What I say is, I have a relationship with God. It's not any kind of belief, and it's just like a personal relationship. You see the way God plays out in your life, and that's the things that you go through in your life that just it's God manifesting in this most amazing way. Yeah.
Mhm. I know you were raised atheist, but
Well,
at what?
no, it
No?
was just,
Okay.
no, it was not atheism. It was just that my dad had been through, I gather, some pretty horrible experiences in World War II. And he came back kind of, you know, I guess bitter from, imagine the thing of a young man,
Yeah.
23 years old,
Uh-huh.
as a medic, seeing the war wounded and having to cut a soldier down who had hung himself, and so on and so on and so on. And so, when he came back, I think he was just focused on trying to help people. He was learning medicine. And and fortunately for me, see, I found God by a different realm than you know religion and so on. So, or I don't know, are you from down south, Peggy?
No, just Ohio.
Okay, well, see, down here, I'll just tell you the truth. One day my wife and I was talking. A lady who she had known came up to see us at a table where we're sitting at a restaurant. The lady was carrying an 18-month-old baby in her arms, and Cheryl just noticed. She said, "Oh, y'all are not in church today." And the woman got very, you know, um, uneasy and like guilt ridden. She said, "Oh, since she's come along, we have trouble coming into." And I said, "Well, yeah, I know what you mean. We had trouble too when ours were that age because they were afraid of snakes." And I was just making a joke. But anyway, you're too far north to appreciate the humor of Alabama humor. So,
Oh,
but
okay.
anyway, but see, I just love God, and that's it. I'm not worried about ideologies.
Uh-huh. We were talking on the phone earlier today, and I was saying, we have things in common, like we both worked in a psychiatric situation in maximum security prisons, and we know
Right.
that part of reality, humanity. And we also adopted too. I had 60 foster
Oh,
kids. We adopted
oh,
10 altogether. I know
oh,
you've adopted.
thank you for all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And my second NDE, I lost my twins in that as ectopic pregnancy. And so I
Um,
relate too to the loss of your son. It's just, I think it's like 36 hours old or something.
it
And
was.
so I've always felt, you dear to my heart for that, because, it takes one to know one, that kind of loss.
It does. It does. And then my wife had ectopic pregnancies for many years too. And that's why,
She-
you send up prayer. That's how it works. I mean, you just surrender. So Dr. George Ritchie, you may have heard of, is
yes.
yeah. And Dr. Ritchie said I had been stewing and stewing and stewing about some problem, or I forgot now even what it was, but it seemed so serious. And, I was just, almost on the verge of, oh, let me just get it all over and commit suicide. I mean, not really that bad, but the thinking. And so finally, I just sort of said, God, you take it. And then it just solved itself. Something happened that very day. So I was talking to George that very day, and I described that experience. And he said, surrender is the most powerful prayer.
Yes, it
It is.
is.
It is. Yeah.
It is. And even in our dating relationships, we fall in love. It takes that surrender to say, okay, I give up, and I am going to allow myself to fall in love with this person, or I'm going to take the leap of faith and get married, or the surrender, and we have children, or and even us NDEs, we have to surrender too
Oh,
to
yeah.
it, and say, I'm going to come forward with this, and the chips are going to fall where they may.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife and I just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. And
Congratulations.
that's such a treat, to think back on all those things and our wonderful kids. I remember it's just like adopted them at birth, and now they're grown and they're still living with us.
Yay. How old are they?
Their Carter is 25 and Carolyn is 22.
Okay.
Yeah, and
My
still
husband,
happily.
awesome. My husband and I will celebrate our 26th in November.
Wonderful.
And we're in the process of getting custody of our youngest grandchildren who are 6 and 7. So we'll be starting over.
Yeah, it's how old are you?
Pardon me?
How old are you?
I'm 62. Me and my husband both are.
62. Yeah,
Mhm.
well, I was, let's see, 54 when Carter came along and 56 when Carol
Okay.
Lynn came.
Okay.
And it was just a wonderful experience because you observe, right?
Yeah. How old are your other kids? You had kids before, right?
Yes, and they are finally grown. I mean, finally in the sense of not finally, but finally, Finely. Just really terrific. Carter is almost 50 now, and he is a PhD and he studies Spanish linguistics. And my wonderful son Avery, the older one, is 52 now,
Okay.
and he is proudly the medical director of a prison and
Wow.
loves his career in prison medicine.
That's awesome. My oldest three boys are in their 40s now. So it's funny to say how old your kids are. You get older, isn't
It
it?
is because, see, by this time of life, your time is speeding by so quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How many grandkids you have?
One, and Ray is just a genius. I mean, absolutely, just an amazing person. And holy mackerel, he's thinking of medicine or architecture.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
And something, I think that we really are, Peggy, seriously on the verge of a genuine rational breakthrough in the study of this big question of the afterlife. And I think the way it's coming about is very different from what we might have imagined. Um, uh, what has happened is, especially with the advent of the cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques in the 60s, I guess, in the 70s, suddenly this experience that had always occurred throughout human history, but was incredibly rare because only very rarely did somebody who was appeared dead somehow be revived. But it did occur, so people knew about it. And not only that, see, it was part of the very origins of Western thought. The people who put this thing together that we're in, and all had a thing, were these people like Plato, Democritus, and all. And that's what they were interested in. A big thing is these very experiences. That's how they sharpened their conceptual tools by thinking all this. So it's kind of inbuilt into our very system of thinking. And so what has happened because of this shift in the CPR is that we have created like a flock. I mean, just like I think how many people you've interviewed. I mean, it's endless. It's happening all the time. It's constantly people getting sort of whisked away into another realm of existence. And they agree to a large degree on what it's like. They agree that it's ineffable, but also they communicate about the common characteristics this place has. And so um, putting that all together, that means that the afterlife has penetrated this life we're in. bit by bit, to the point where we can kind of wake up now to the, oh yeah, well, them near-death experiences. My my cousin-in-law Josh over to the funeral factory, he was had one of them experiences, and we all know about it, right? And so but it's not, it's like reading in a book or seeing it on TV. It's like, the cousin Henry or whoever. And that really does put it on an entirely different footing when it's not a book or an abstraction, but it's woven itself into the very fabric of the society. There's a huge number of people who've been beyond and back. Some of them quite a number of times. I've known a number of people who had cardiac conditions that were chronic cardiac conditions largely, but who over a number of years had a number of near-death experiences. So their trajectory is our common sense puts an absolute wall between here and there. But if you look at the lived reality of it, there's lots of people whose course through it is more like this. Yeah. And the older you get, the more people like there are. So what this near-death experience is, it seems to me, and you've observed it happen too, don't you think it's made a fundamental shift in society at some level?
I do, but I feel like it's not enough. I want more. Like I wanted to get out of the entertainment and the wow factor and just for views and book sales and ticket sales and out of the paranormal realm and into actual study, because I believe that this and you talked about this other realm of existence. I believe we can access that, and that is speaking from NDE, where I have access that on the other side in spiritual experiences and NDEs. And I believe that we can access that other side. And I'll tell you why. The first time I shared my near-death experience at Ian's group in Columbus years ago, and I was a real shy person, like you would not catch me, speaking to public, but I really wanted to share my experience. And when I stood up in this group and I started talking about my first NDE at 5 years old when I drowned, suddenly I am hovering over that pond again. I am accessing, and it's like something just, I let go of my mind and entered into that realm of knowledge, is what I call it, the land of all knowing, where you're free of your thoughts and there's no inhibitions. And then I went on and talked about other experiences in my second NDE, and I felt like I was levitating, and I stayed that way for hours even after I'd left that talk. And I felt like I was harnessing something, like I was coming out, like this light was coming out of my fingertips, and I was just in this bliss state. And I can still get to that state when I get talking about my NDEs or spiritual things, or I get all wound up. And I feel like, I was trying to explain it to my husband this morning, and he says, that sounds like a tornado, how tornado comes down and it spins and it pulls everything up. And it's like this force of energy. And I'm no longer thinking through my brain and my knowings. And it's through that place of existence and we get knowing out of there. We can get knowledge out of there that we can never otherwise get. And that's what I want science to realize, that we can access this land of, I call, all knowing. We really can, as we're living. We don't have to wait till we had to wait for a lot of stuff for when we die, right? But I mean, as we're here, we really can access that land of all knowing, and we can know things about our family, about our future, these insights, when we actually can get in that, I don't know if you call it white light realm, whatever it is. There is something magical there that science refuses to find.
Peggy, the term for that experience you had, I don't know if anybody's ever told you, but that experience is what's called ecstasy. And it's the feelings, the the high feelings, the great feelings, tend to be in ease, elation, um, ecstasy. Um, and so, yeah, that, and there's an entire very wise book on ecstasy, and that's the title of it, by a psychologist, I think from the 20s or 30s. I think it's probably still in print. But she investigated this whole phenomenon of ecstasy and had many examples. And I'm sure you'd find that, because what your description there was that's just a perfect description of the feeling of ecstasy, or
And it
the
can,
experience of
yeah, and
ecstasy.
it can happen too on, like when you said, like, if I heard you right, like a moment of almost like the suicidal, when you talk to George Ritchie and you get into those moments where you surrender. That's kind of like on the other side of the coin. Like we can access it through there too. Those moments where we like give up, like, God, I have tried everything, I have failed, or this is horrible situation, and yada yada. And somehow God comes through.
Yeah, yeah. It's just you just got to get into the flow of giving it over to God. That's the thing. And the way I've come, you're a little young for this one, but I guarantee you'll get here. It's I did a year of geriatric psychiatry for the folks in this little town who, it wasn't proper to have make them come to the front door of the mental health clinic, because they're seen on TV worldwide all the time, or the mayor or the police chief. It's just common courtesy. And so, since I was the oldest resident, and since I was known for my book, I was it. And so, for a year, I sat there. Some of them were dementia, but it was the great majority. It was like, I tell you the truth, it was loneliness, just wanting somebody to talk to, and then, or situational stress. And repeatedly, I heard these very accomplished, wise people in many fields say to me, like, looking back, like, Raymond, the older I get, the more there was an uncanny feeling I get. It's like when I look back that my life has been a movie or a novel or a story or a drama. They would use different words. But and what that's all about is, I think, if you think about it, consciousness itself is a narrative phenomenon. What I mean by that is, when some new event happens to you, what does your conscious mind do? It weaves that new event into your continuing life story, doesn't it? So that's how what I think is, and this may seem radical, but I say we are God's stories. When we get up with God in this life review, it's obviously He's very aware of your story, right? He wants to know how this came out. So it's your personal identity is your story.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does this have to do with our new book, Proof of Life After Life? Well, to me, I think, Peggy, and I wonder what you think about this. I think it's reached the point where what I mean by saying that proof of life after life is that this has reached the point such that if somebody is genuinely curious and wants to know whether there is an afterlife, I think they can go through a process and that they can be confident that they, based on rational considerations, not on any kind of wishful thinking or anything like that, but rather on genuinely rational condition on situations, that it's rational for them to think and anticipate that this is not all there is. And not only that, and this is more important to me, that if you look at it even deeper and you want to get down to the mechanics of this, which is what most people are not interested in, that those big, deep objections that the great skeptics, and I'm not talking about this humanist crowd who don't know what skepticism is. I'm talking about the people like David Hume, who were skeptics, that when the big objections that they justifiably and truly raised to this kind of possibility, I claim on the stake of my reputation that, yeah, that big problems, those big problems have been solved so that now we have genuine rational basis on which to investigate the question of life after death. Notice I'm not saying scientific. One of the big difficulties I think you sense in this too is that it's people love that word science, even if they don't have much of a sense of what it means.
Right.
But they just want to hear that word scientific.
Yeah.
In reality, in 2023, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question. That does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that it is not, therefore, a rational question. It is fully a rational question, and it is then in the domain specifically of the field of philosophy. But like many philosophical questions over the centuries, all the questions at first were philosophical. Then somebody makes some discovery that takes it into a science. Well, I think we're pretty much on the verge of that now. So this is, I feel that, it's looking up and that we have not now a rigorous proof of an afterlife, but I say absolutely a rational pathway toward it.
Okay. I just would like to get it in the universities where you could go in and actually take classes and learn about the afterlife and learn about, evidence of, near-death experience, how we can actually sit down and go about proving it. And it just seems like nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants those in their universities.
Yeah, and for justifiable reasons, often, Peggy. I mean, let's face it, you must see that there's so much in this field that we love that there is a great deal of unjustifiable latitude. Let's just face it. I mean, listen, I was in Europe a few years back before the plague, and then when in Denmark, or I think it was, or in one of those Scandinavian countries, invited there by a medical group, and and they were putting their, Denmark is that's kind of Straitsville, if you ask me. And I mean, I love the Danes, and they're pretty. It's rigid is the word I would use, but I mean, I just love them. But they are very narrow and straight, and it's the happiest society there is, they say. But my point is that these were people whose this integrity and the principle that they operate by being very strong. And when I went there, this physician who had put herself out to bring this startling information to these Dutch physicians, to these Danish physicians, it was kind of horrifying when I met her at the airport, because after I had agreed to come and all, we put all this together, she was looking on some sort of internet thing about all the people who study this, and she came across some woman. I've never figured out who this was, but the woman was putting herself forward as the expert on near-death experience based on some degree she had. So this physician checked into what this so-called credential was, and it came from a diploma mill in, I think, some India or somewhere. And the way you got that degree was you submitted a saliva sample. See, and now what I'm getting at is, because this information is so important, we have got to be very, very, integrity has to be the core of this whole kind of investigation.
We have the skeptics, and then we have the people that think, oh, they had an NDE. I'm going to buy anything they're selling.
Yeah, well, there's the imposter phenomenon too. Let's face it that way. The more confident somebody portrays themselves, the more unrealistic it is to me. I mean, the people I know who had near-death experiences, you ask them these big questions of existence. Well, I don't know really that part. I was limited to what this part I saw, but I thought, well, maybe it's this. You ask one of these people you're talking about, what's it like? Oh, yes, it's exactly like this. There's 7 steps you go through. That's hogwash. It's
Yeah.
hogwash. This somebody a near-death experience conveys a awareness on the part of people of the extreme limits of their knowledge. Don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that impression? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all I have is questions. I don't have a lot of answers. I just have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
The
me too.
more I put the pieces
And it's
together.
a lot more fun than thinking you know the answers.
Yeah. Because the more I explore it, the more questions I have. But I
Me too.
have made a lot. I find in these aha moments, the connections I do make, but still that brings out more questions.
How old are you again, Peg?
62.
62. All right, I got 17 years on. Let me project what you're going to begin to feel like. And because I've been through this very thing in the last few years. Developmentally, you become more aware of the uh, illusion like aspect of it. It's like you become more attuned of the little glitches in it that show that it's a projection, right? Or a story, kind of, right? You see yourself in my life, it's like in 1981 or 2 in the spring. I had a daydream or a fantasy one evening in my porch swing in Charlottesville, Virginia. At that time, I had 2 wonderful sons, but there was preeclampsia, so no more tries for my wife. But I'd always wanted a girl, a daughter always. And so I don't know where this fantasy came from. It's like deep within, wouldn't it be wonderful to adopt a Native American daughter? Never, I didn't even send it up as a prayer, never put a moment's effort into it. 19 years later, it came to be it's an incredible story, but basically I just met this wonderful Native American woman and don't want to even call it a favor for her. It's just something anybody would do. And then, 4 years later, out of nowhere, she calls us. Oh, how are you doing? Wonderful chipper voice, and say, oh, we're doing great. We've adopted a baby, Carter. Oh, I wish so much had known you were looking because on the reservation, I work in the hospital. I'm the first person to know when we need an adoptive situation. 2 months later, she called. Now, by all means, I say 2 months later, your daughter is on her way. And I know that I have a Native American daughter who is a Native American through and through. I mean, we adopted her the moment of birth, but oh my gosh, she's just the ability to see birds nest. I mean, it's astonishing. And so, see this, and I'm not talking me. I'm talking God, right? That God brought this into being.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes we ask without realizing we're asking.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And sometimes there's a trick to it, but it works out great. You're too old to remember on TV Gary Moore and Arthur Godfrey. Okay, but when I was a kid, they were the TV celebrities. Now, this was 54, 55. This was before they realized the power of television. That's what you learn in grammar school or high school now about the power of this instrument. This was the 50s. Nobody had figured out all those things about how it affected people. So Gary Moore was the host of an evening game show called I've Got a Secret. So he was very popular. And Arthur Godfrey held out the afternoons on the network with his sort of variety show. So they were just very well respected. You know, everybody knew these two people. So one day, as still they do, Oprah interviews Geraldo, Geraldo interviews Oprah, and then, Phil, and so it was that sort of thing. And so on this one day on the Arthur Godfrey show, he was interviewing Gary Moore. And Gary Moore had a crew cut, so his hair stuck really straight up like this. And on this one day, he was talking about something that had happened to him a day or so before. And when he was telling the story, his eyes were so wide that it emphasized that appearance of his hair standing straight up. And he was telling it with like incomprehension and horror. And what he said like this, whenever days before, he had gone down to the marina where he kept his boat. And he said, as he approached his boat, this total stranger bounced down, grabbed his hand and popped it. Hi, Gary, how you doing? I see you on TV all the time. Heard this was your boat. Now, you and I can comprehend that better, far better than Gary Moore could. See what I'm saying? Just think about it. I mean, people didn't understand the power of this celebrity. And so he was horrified. So at that moment, I, being very shy and retiring, I've been told I have, and I guess I finally accepted Asperger's syndrome and socially awkward and such. And I remember hearing this account by Gary Moore and having the following thought. And time kind of slowed down. And this was on my grandma's black and white TV screen. Okay, and time slowed down. And I thought it would be horrible to be famous. I was just, oh my God, it's horrible. What a horrible thing to be famous. And then it was not like a voice, but it was a presence. It's just things got really still. I mean, the presence. Mm-hmm. And what the presence said, I didn't realize then. But now I realize what the presence was saying. Let's see. Right? I mean, God has a sense of humor. Let's say so. Well, let's see. And I realized in the process that, yeah, it was just as terrible as I imagined in many ways. Because, I'm a recluse. And yet it opened me up to all of these wonderful things. See, so and life is like that. It's story. And the older you get, the more you realize that it's a story. And so going back to what I was saying, like project ahead where you're going to be when you are at now. You get to where more and more you now are in a situation where you can sometimes realize, oh yeah, this is a story. I'm in a movie, right? Yeah. But you're just getting it maybe like, all right, here's the course of your life. Maybe you get it here, and then maybe a week later here, and then, But see, as you go along, the moments get more and closer together. And so now I am at a state where I can keep both tracks going at once. See, the trouble with it normally is you can get this insight that it's just a movie and a story, and then the cop car screams by outside, or the airplane part falls on the roof, or your dog, starts mangling pigeon outside, or or whatever happens. And so this thing is immersive. It's like you can't just float up above it and have that insight that it's moving, because it brings you back down. But see, what I'm getting at, that you can keep to where you're really pretty much keeping it, also, all the time, that, this is story and this is God's movies we're in, and that it all has a good ending.
I think when we're born, we're all given like this $1 billion piece puzzle. And when we're born, the puzzle's just like open and scattered to the wind. And as we live
Yeah.
our life, we're picking up
Oh
each
my
piece.
gosh.
So when we get older, the piece is coming in, the picture's coming into view of all
Mhm.
these pieces, how they were all put together and how they all
Yeah.
expanded. And now we see the play, we see the movie, because
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
we're getting
Exactly.
towards the end, and it's making the picture now. We can see it.
Yeah. That I was the first living person I ever heard tell a near-death experience was Dr. George Ritchie, right?
Return from Tomorrow. I love that
Uh,
book.
yeah, and George was from Richmond, Virginia, and my parents were from uh, Porterdale, Georgia. Okay, George's experience took place at Camp Barkley, Texas, in December 1943, when he was a recruit undergoing basic training and uh, and as Fort, this Camp Barkley, and so he developed double lobar pneumonia during this training, and was found apparently dead in bed. They don't know how long before the ward boy found him apparently dead, but so counting from that point, he was dead 9 minutes. Okay. Now, I heard George's experience in 1965, and as you know, it just transformed my life. And so I um, I didn't have any contact with George all those years after that initial thing, and that was 65. All right, then life after life, I didn't have any contact with George until 1975 November, when the book was in galley proof. It had been written a year before, but it was published in November. And I called George to ask if I could dedicate the book to him. But that was the only contact. All right. Now, I went to medical school in Georgia, but I had gone to the University of Virginia to get my BA, MA, and PhD. So I wanted to go back to Charlottesville to do my psychiatry residency. So the book was published in November of 75, and I graduated from medical school in January of 76. And in March of 76, we went back flew to Charlottesville to be interviewed for my psychiatry residency. And when I was there, called Dr. Ritchie. Oh, just hear from my rent. Oh, please come on over. Oh, such sweet man at dinner. So only contact. Next day, flew back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents were taking care of our kids. Okay, and I sitting there in the den with my dad. I mentioned that the night before I'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, the first living person I heard this from. And by then, my dad had heard a tape of Dr. Ritchie's experience. And I swear to the holy God, we both laughed. This is what my father said, because I remember this because by then I understood as a budding psychiatrist that when people sound like they're talking in a telegraphic speech, they call it, it's a sign of anxiety. So my father said the following words, George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. I was there. and so were you. So my mom and dad had moved to Camp Barkley in early September 1943, so my dad could go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September 43. George's experience was December 24th, as I remember, 1943, and mom and dad moved away December 29th, 1943. I was there in utero. Now, flash forward. Following my dear Uncle Fairley, it loved to ride it. He rode me around in his law enforcement vehicle all the time when I was a kid, way out in the middle of nowhere on his route one day. This was 1964. Came into the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, an old grist mill. It was out in the middle of nowhere. And I said, what a place to live. I don't know where it's now. Next couple of summers, I looked all around Georgia and found out two things. Number one, they're few and far between. Number two, people who own them don't want to sell them. Okay, so I had surrendered that, okay, back in 66 or 67. Now, flash forward to 1989, and I was a professor at West Georgia College, now University, in Carrollton, Georgia. I was a professor of psychology, and I had come across an interesting thing I was wanting to research, but I needed a research facility that was out in the country. But never did I think in Old Mill. Okay, but I was just thinking, place out in the country. Looked all around Carrollton, that's too close to Atlanta. The prices, real estate is too much. Okay, so one day in November of 89, Nancy Gillespie, the psychology department secretary, said, Raymond, if you just go right across the state line into Alabama, 11 miles, she said, the real estate over there is just, you won't believe how inexpensive. She said, you won't be able to find a place up there. So I contacted a friend of mine who was from Alabama, was a real estate agent in Georgia and Atlanta. Robin, will you try to find? I have no sense of direction, by the way. All I said, my criteria was this: it has to be close enough out in the country, has to be close enough to the state line that I can get back and forth 3 times a week to teach my classes. Those were the only criteria, and I wouldn't know anyway if she said where we were going. So this late in January, late one evening, Raymond, can you go to Alabama tomorrow? Yes. Pick me up. I don't know where we're going. She takes me to this place, and she said the reason I chose this place is that her son was a good friend of the chief deputy sheriff, and I think he probably might have known my uncle and brother. I mean, those law enforcement folks. I don't know about Ohio, but in Georgia, they all know. Everybody knows each other, right? Yeah. And so anyway, but it was very nice, and he had read my book. So again, no mention of an old mill swing. All right, so then he starts taking us around. And I saw about this old Victorian cottage that had a for sale sign. It's beautiful. And so the Don, the sheriff, the real estate agent's name was Kirk Moore. And Don said, oh, Kirk is a good friend of mine. Let's just go right now into his place. And, and we can see that house. So I went to Kirk's office, and Kirk was standing up, and I was standing to the side, and I said, I'm interested in that little Victorian cottage you have for sale. And he said, well, what are you looking for? He said those exact words. What are you looking for? I said, well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm looking for a place out in the country where I can do some research and writing. And I swear to God, I was looking from the side. I saw his eyes close. Let me take you by a place near where I live. Down a road across this beautiful iron old bridge to a mill, a grist mill. Am I dreaming or what? But he said, but the trouble is, he said, it's not for sale. Said that. The reason I'm showing it to you, he says, is that it's owned by an elderly couple who've been here for a long time, and they want to stay there, but their children have grown up and have moved downtown, become like down city people, and worried about their elderly parents living out there all in the middle of nowhere as it was then. And so they had sort of suggested to Kirk, if there's any way we could, you can try to ease our parents out. And so now that was the day before cell phones. Okay. So Kurt just turned around, went back to his office and called from there. And I heard what he said. I heard her voice from him. He said, Miss Dora, this is Kurt Moore. Can I bring a man by from out of town by to see your house? Now, I'll tell you from living there for 25 years as I did, I'll tell you exactly probably how she heard it was. Can I come by and look at your house? We got that all the time by architects or and so, but she was cautious. You can't, Kurt, but we're not going to sell our house. So again, I swear to God, Peggy, walked in. How are you? I'm Raymond Moody. Miss Doris. Raymond Moody. Raymond Moody. Are you the man that wrote that book? She took me right over to the bookshelf there beside the fireplace and got out George Ritchie's book, to which I had written the foreword. And she opened it out to me to show the inscription. And she said, well, Dr. George Ritchie is one of our dear, dear friends. Like, this must be a sign. So I'm not being autobiographical here, Peggy. I'm to the point of what you just said.
Yeah.
Right? It's what could that be but God? Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to be able to add it up and find the only explanation that there is.
Yeah, and I know about the folks, listening in. It's like that word science there. It's uncomfortable, right? But let me explain another simple concept that I always talk to my philosophy students that will be very helpful to the people listening in to us who have these interests that you and I do. And that is that there is a big, huge difference between science and scientism. And it is very important to not get those two confused. Okay. What science is one thing, it's a certain method. Okay. Scientism is not science, but a social theory about science. Social and epistemological, sorry for that big word, but epistemological just means theory of knowledge, right? Having to do with knowledge. And it's an epistemological theory is the theory about knowledge. Okay. And so scientism is an epistemological doctrine that scientific method is the only rational means of establishing truth and knowledge. That's just what it means. And a lot of Americans fall for that, interestingly enough. And interestingly enough, I noticed when I was teaching this as a philosophy professor, even students who are very religious will fall for this. Because in the first couple of days of my class, I would just say, kids, what do y'all think about knowledge is? And what they come up with is, well, science is knowledge. They say, well, let's be a little more specific. What are we saying? Well, we're saying, ultimately, what they'll come up with on their own thinking is, well, scientific method is the only rational means to secure truth and establish knowledge. And so once they state it like that, I write it up on the board and I say, well, is that what you think? And they say, yeah, yeah, yeah. So I write it out on the board. Scientific method is the only rational means of securing truth and establishing knowledge. And then I draw a rectangle and I point to it and I say, well, how do you know that? Now let's just think about that situation for a minute. We only have two options that I can see. One, we can say scientific method is the only rational means of securing truth and establishing knowledge. And I know that by the scientific method is a fallacy that's called petitio principii is the name of it, but what it means is reasoning in a circle. It's just assuming what you set out to prove. See, well, scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge. Well, how do you know that? Well, I know about scientific method. That's just reasoning in a circle, right? On the other hand, the only other option that seems to me is to say, well, scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge. And I know that by history or philosophy or the law or literary theory. And that is a self-contradiction. It's a self-contradiction to say scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge, and I know that by some other means of rational knowledge. See what I'm talking about? So scientism is just bunk. It's an attitude that certain very narrow people have because they don't want to think in any other way except by some routine. And and uh, and where it really boils down to in the real world of 2023, and so far as this world is real, is that in this frame of time, the question of life after death still resides in the domain of philosophy. And we should be proud of that, see, because it means there's still room. We're still working on it. We're still looking for the great way to solve it.
And NDEs disprove, if we use the word science, because I don't know what else to use, but, say like Eben Alexander, they give him, what is it, 5%, 3% chance, of survival. And if he did, he's going to be vegetable, and like Anita Morjani, she was a goner,
Yeah.
cancer just killed her, and they defy the odds. And it seems like a lot of NDEers defy the odds when they come back. And that's defying
Oh, yeah.
science.
Well, it is or it isn't, Peggy. I mean, the thing about it is science is great within its limitations. And the people you're thinking of who are obnoxious, frankly, they have like an ideology. It's the real scientific spirit is really great fun. It's just like inquiry. And what I'm getting at is that the people who are obnoxiously, antithetical to these things about near-death experiences, that's not really anything to do with science as much as they might. That's how they put it to themselves. But I think it's basically, and talking with one of them, for example, I mean, this was just the greatest thing. And I just saw that in action once. This biochemist who was just so absolute. He was, and this was in a far distant country, so I wouldn't want to sound unkind because he was a very nice guy, but this was another country way away. So anyway, I was invited there to talk about near-death experiences, and due to the arrangements and all, it happened that the guy who was coming to pick me up at the airport was like a molecular biologist. Okay, and a very distinguished one. And he knew not, I mean, just vaguely hearing about these people. And to him, this is, alpha 1, 2, 9, 5, 8, 6 alpha telomerase probably reaction there. He's thinking like this and biochemical things. And it was And so and he confidently said, "Oh yeah, well, this is the biochemical reactions in the brain." And I said, "Well, the trouble is that the people at the bedside who are not ill or injured have these same experiences." And it his circuits went berserk. I mean, literally, he was a very nice man. This is nothing hostile. It was just like you could just tell his circuits literally went berserk. I mean, and he had no recourse except just to totally wipe it from his consciousness. I saw him do it, and that's a pitiful thing. And thank goodness people get focused like that because they create these great discoveries because they can focus on these very narrow areas. And you know, by the way, am I running over our time?
Oh, it doesn't matter to me. It's up to you. I mean, whatever. I was just thinking while you was talking about several years ago, I went to a symposium that Jeffrey Olson had put on, and I met Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, and I felt led to speak to Spencer, Jeff Olson's son. And
Mm-hmm.
I went outside and talked to him, and I said, I felt his mother. I felt Jeff's wife. I felt her pushing me. And so I went out and I talked to him and I said, I felt really shy about talking to him, being forward, talking to a young man. And I said, do you realize this whole symposium, everything your dad's doing, it's not about your dad, it's about you. It's about your mom defied the laws of nature to make sure he come back for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said, he says, I knew that, but I forgot it. He's like, can I hug you?
That's
And
sweet.
I just felt his mother's presence, like just wanted him to know how much she loved him. And this was because everything Jeff's doing is because of her love for him, made sure he come back. So Spencer wouldn't be raised alone, an orphan. And it's just those moments we have in all of our lives that we know are, I don't want to use the word supernatural because I hate that word, but that are out of our brain and out of our reality and out of anything that makes sense, but we know it to be true more than anything.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Acts
And
of
you know something?
kindness or helping your
Yeah.
helping someone in need, or you know
Yeah. Yeah. You know something? You hear that when I was a kid, I heard that the happiest life is a life of service to others. And as a kid, you hear that as an ideal, a nice ideal, but it's like an ideal. Then you get into the midlife crisis years and everything is turned around. And then you begin to hear it as an aspiration. But by the time you're 79 years old, it's just a fact of experience. And I learned years ago that as long as you're focusing on yourself, you're always miserable. It's like the happiness is to turn out like to make things good for other people. That I mean, and then it's happy. And mine too is like a necessary part of life too. I mean, is humor is very big to me. I was oddly enough, I was a comedian for a while and wanted to be a comedian when I was a kid, and still enjoy doing it. I just Evan, by the way, and Karen, they really, they like to, my stuff. So
when you called me earlier, my husband come got me out of the shower. He's like, you want to take this call? So I'm stepping out, I'm dripping, and you're just cracking one joke after the other. And I'm like, huh? What? I was like, oh, he's not serious. That's my husband. He cracks jokes all the time too. So I was like, oh, okay, that's what's happening.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's like love's what it's all about, just like you're saying. And then we always must caution. As George Ritchie urgently came to my house, just called and just kind of come by a minute, wouldn't even sit down, and had this urgent message. And he said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden. And if I may translate, because George was very kind, or like he would not say unkind things. But from what I just to put piecing together from that same sentiment I've heard expressed by many, many people with NDEs, and I suspect you can relate to it as well. That, let's face it, even after this vision of love and all, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, isn't it? I mean, and Jordan, that doesn't stop. I mean, but I know I've seen people over decades. They do. It works to keep working.
We're still human. I mean, we're not saints, but it is a strange thing to live life knowing what death is like, because most people don't.
Neither here nor there is a strange state, but it's coming more and more, and it's becoming more and more toward the norm. Yeah. And the next stage of this, as I foresee, is that the logic that we use to try to think about it, is great logic, but it doesn't work for life after death. But that is not to despair, because it's fairly easy to come up with a new way of thinking that is perfectly logical and you can learn easily, and that it does throw light in a whole new way of thinking about the afterlife. But just the problem here is this: when people hear that, they want a nirvana immediately. They think it's like, oh, it's going to cure my bunions, just all of that. But it's not instant gratification. It's not like a panacea for life's problems. But there are new ways to think about thinking, which enable us to get around the big objections and difficulties that the great thinkers have found with the question of life after death. And this will sink in, but it will not sink in through the system of that you and I are in, the subculture of people are interested in this. Because what our subculture is interested in is the narrative aspect. And the conceptual aspect is not for most folks liking, right?
Yeah. I feel like I'm so past the narrative. I want answers. I can't help it. I want answers. Like, say my 5-year-old drowning, it was all out of body. I know what it's like to be a ghost kid running around town looking for other kids to play with. And the experience I had as a ghost kid. And then 20 years later, at 25, I was like through the tunnel in the right way, in heaven, arguing at God. I got to raise my boys and all this stuff. And then, so, all these years, it's like, I'm trying to make sense. And so people just had one NDE. They think, well, therefore it's all like this. I'm like, wait a minute, no. And so I had a light bulb come on the other day, and it doesn't mean that this is the final answer to it. But I thought, wait a minute. So I always wondered, well, how come I had out of body, didn't go to heaven at 5, but at 25, I went straight there. And then I had this light bulb, and I don't know if it's the correct light bulb, but it was like, because it wasn't my time. And the powers that be, God, knew that it wasn't my time. So I was just to hang around because I was going back, which is the first thing the angel said to me after, as I hovered over the pond, was, don't go yet. If they find you soon, you might go back. And I'm like, what? That's not how death works. So I had this epiphany the other day. I was like, wait a minute. It wasn't my time. That's why I didn't go to heaven. Because in the second NDE, I was told the answer is no, I can't go back. I was told it was my time, which most people aren't told that. They're told it's not your time, you got to go back. So when I had this epiphany the other day, I'm like, okay, well, what about everybody? It says that they were told that it wasn't their time. What were they even doing there? I mean, why were they even there? Why were they brought there if it wasn't their time? Why didn't they have around like I did as a ghost kid?
Well, see, Peggy, look at this difficulty you're having in expressing this, right? And what I'm getting at here is that our generation of people with interest in this, it's like the way we look at it is the experiential and narrative aspect of it. And by contrast to that, for most people, the conceptual thinking is boring. But see, that very system of conceptual thinking that's new is going to come in not through the interest we have, but through, get this, advertising, psychology, spirituality in a way. The real blocking concept, if this sounds so counterintuitive, folks, I realize it all, but I mean, yeah, counterintuitive. But what the people who've really thought through the afterlife question seriously, not trying to say that it is, but just trying to think about the concept, what they have concluded, like Hume and others, is that the logic we have is not fit to work on it, because it's our logic is predicated on the law of non-contradiction. And when you say there is life after death, that is a self-contradiction, right? But then it gets harder to, well, how do you think your way out of that? And so basically what the problem is, to call the technical name of it, is unintelligibility. That the notion of life after death compared to a person who thinks logically and who wants to make an experiment or a way of proving it or disproving it, that the logic that we have is not adequate, because there's no way to put it into the meaningful context that we need for that application. And that's kind of works out in reality. But people who are making it want to make money have, as in the courses I've taught, from advertising. For example, love my course, because one thing advertising is all about is unintelligibility, right? It's like advertisers found that if you can use nonsense, that people will pay more attention to that than they remember that ad, bada book, bada boom. Remember that about the motels? Anyway, if you watch overviews, you see, and so also and lawyers came to my courses because they need to, they want to keep their analytical, critical thinking skills sharp, so they loved it. Medical doctors, psychologists, some people even in religious studies, because nonsense, as much as we dislike the word, has played a huge role in human spirituality.
I hate that.
What?
I said, I hate that.
Oh, no, please
You know what I
think of
mean?
it.
I hate that
No,
fact. I know it's a fact, but I hate it.
well, but think about this. The people with speaking in unknown tongues, what this is a powerful spiritual modality. It's basically what it is. It consists of nonsense syllables drawn from that speaker's native language, put together in such a way to avoid meaningful combinations and grammatical structures. Well, as I've done this myself, you don't need to be in a church. This is astonishing. What you do, you just let yourself go, you start doing it. And speaking of the ecstasy, yes, you reach an ecstatic state from it. That's why they do it. And and so see, and another one is and nowadays in the Christian thing, for example, it's the Trinity is a doctrine, right? The notion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But in the medieval context, it was not a doctrine. It was like a koan. It was like a way of meditating on the identity of God, because you see the the unintelligibility of it, right? You try to think of God as the three, and imagine that mental exercise. It's great. It's mind bending. So, and then the koans. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, that's a nonsense question, but the student's supposed to keep thinking about it logically until it flips him out of the logical realm into a new spiritual realm. So, and there's many other examples.
When you said Father, Son, Holy Spirit, I don't know why I just made the connection of like Father as in past, Son as in future, and Holy Spirit as in now.
You're doing it right now. See, you're beginning to think of this, and now all these things come up. That's why people said that it wasn't some doctrine. It was just like what you just did. It was make you think. See, and that's nonsense. But
Because what
holy.
My second NDE, what I couldn't figure out is there's a part of it where Jesus, I see him from behind, because I say the words if to God, if you can prove to me my sons will be better off without me, for whatever reason, I agree to stay. But if not, I beg to return because I wanted to go back and raise him. And then I see Jesus from behind, and we just woof like or saw each other, and we're down, we're above the trailer, and there's a roof. It's at night, and all of a sudden the roof is gone, and we drop down like ceiling level, and I see my sons in the future, and they look the same age. And my middle son, Jeremy, which is my youngest biological, was my younger one was adopted. He says to his older brother, Jeremy, he says, I don't care that you say mom is dead. I want her back, and I want her back right now. And I felt his pain, and I retracted. And so I have spent years wondering, how could I see the future? Which is
Yeah.
what I asked God. Well, I didn't think he would do it. I thought he would explain something to me, say, oh, well, they'll be okay, or they won't be okay, or something. But he did, but he took me in the future. And it's so strange because when I come back from my NDE that night in the wheelchair in the emergency room, I no more had the nausea, the pain. I felt like I was going to pass out. Yeah, I felt fine. But because of the memory, I was just in heaven accepting it, that I knew I was about dead here, and that my doctor, he checked me out. He says, Peggy, you're fine. It's not an ectopic pregnancy. Why do you keep saying that? But because of the NDE, I refused to go home because I knew my sons would find me dead in the morning. And I thought my only options is to either die here at the hospital and let them call my family, or my sons find me dead. And I ain't going to have that. So I stayed. Well, the next morning they come and, found out it was the biggest total pregnancy they ever saw, etc. And I had internal bleeding. But so I think, okay, so when was that? When was that going to happen? The thing that never happened in the boy's bedroom, having to accept my death. I'm thinking, would have been that later that night. I mean, I just have so many questions. Nobody has the answers, right? But it's like it was a scene from the future that never happened, but would have happened if my doctor didn't come in, fix me. They would have been told I was dead. And so it's such a strange thing to
It
see
is
from the
strange,
future. It
Peg.
never happened.
Hey, my dear wife is literally a genius. I mean, by the IQ rating, I mean, it's just phenomenal. Okay. And she is, to my great blessing and benefit, she is totally non-intellectual. Right? I mean, she's as like interests like in topics and all, but she went to arts. Okay. And so, this is just, and so my dear wife is like, I was been philosophical all my life, but several years ago, Cheryl was standing in the living room and I saw a look of just like dawning on her eyes. And she said, time is unreal.
Is what?
Time is unreal.
Unreal.
She said, time is not real. And as a philosophy student, I had realized that as a kid. But then as the older you get, the more it sinks in on a deeper level than the intellectual too. But if the time is unreal, it's a way we sort of have to think about this place we're in, but it doesn't pertain exactly to the realm of reality where you and I are talking about now after you have,
And near
passed
death
out of here.
experiences, they'll talk about like something ancient. They seen something, like their ancestors from a long time ago, or something so far in the past. And yet sometimes these sound so futuristic that God has such a technology we don't yet possess.
Oh,
And
that's a great metaphor. That's a
and
great,
both
yeah,
NDEs, I realized there was, even though they're so different, there's similarities. It's the way
yeah.
communication is. In both NDEs, a like a movie played out, like the thin air
Mhm.
of a past event or event that never even happened, but as an illustration. Like if I could just do this and you just all of a sudden see this scene play out, like I never had to recreate anything. It's just like magic. And then the
I
telepathic
saw the way you
communication.
whirled around your hand there, right?
Pardon me?
I saw the way you whirled around your hand like that. George Ritchie said during his experience in 1943 that he that he got out of his body, tried to get back to Richmond, all these things, but he said that he was there with Christ who showed him a review of his life. But even beyond that, showed him several different levels of existence. And I've heard of the same thing from a number of other people. All of them are people who had extremely lengthy cardiac arrest that don't really make medical sense. Okay, but George said that Christ would show him these different levels of existence. He was looking into this one level, which is kind of close around here, where the people didn't quite get it that they were dead. And they were kind of fumbling around
At
repeating
that bar.
Yeah. And George said it wasn't anything bad. He said, it's more like they didn't wake up or something. And he said
They're
there's
wanting
these
that drink or wanting that smoke. And
yeah, exactly. George said it was the alcohol, right? And so he said that, but it's okay because these enlightened people around, hey, wake up, you know. But then George said, and with a wave of his arm of light, George said, whoosh, the scene just appeared, and this time he was looking into this hyper advanced institution of higher learning. He said, you try to imagine Caltech and MIT, Yale and Harvard and Princeton and all of them just condensed into one. You still couldn't even begin to imagine this. And then after a while, George said, and then with another wave of his arm of light, that all disappeared, and he saw into a realm of sheer light. But what I'm getting at now, I remember George's wife, Marguerite, was just wonderful. When George would say, this was, all right, think back to the 70s, okay? And when George would say that about waving the arm of light, Marguerite would say, I wish George wouldn't say that about waving the arm of light. She thought that was just so bizarre. Now, flash forward to, I think, the second Barack Obama election, the second time he won. I remember Wolf Blitzer, right, was one of the people, but they had all these people on the stage and they had all these displays of the information on the election, and the people would go up there and they would go, whoosh, the whole thing would change. See, and it's now what George saw in this thing in 1943 is we see it on TV every day. And I noticed that you did it too, right? When you were describing how these shifts, you just instinctively threw your hand like that.
there's something about spinning. I was telling my husband this morning that I've had this reoccurring dream. I don't anymore, but I did for a while. I used to have reoccurring dreams. And it was just in every dream, it was a different scene and different people. It was always the same thing I was doing. I was walking around the circle and I get spinning around the circle. And then I get like all revved up of energy and I'm flying around the ceiling. And I come back down and I show other people how to do it. And so I actually stood up this time, was telling my husband this today, and I started spinning. And I started going around in that circle and I started telling, because I was like wound up talking about NDEs and all this stuff. And I got so full of this energy, like the energy when I was saying I first told my NDE at the IONS group in Columbus, and I got full of this energy. And you get wound up in that and you touch that land of knowing. You start knowing stuff and understanding stuff at a heightened rate of speed that my mind can't do. It's an added insight.
Yeah. And you know what you're describing was done by the Sufis, right?
Really?
In the Islam was the whirling dervish. That's what they were doing. And in the Caribs, in the Caribbean, the Native American people who lived down there, their shamans would have a swing or like a little platform and a leather straps they just wound up and up and up and up and up. And the shaman would sit on the swing the little slat, and they would let him loose, and it would go faster and faster and faster. And all of this time, see, he would have to be chanting the ritual formula or the prayer, whatever. And so all of these things are, or you think about little kids playing at the playground with the merry-go-round. So see, these things that manifest as recreation on one level also recommend, manifest as, profound spiritual things. And by the way, to my sadness,
Okay.
I'm going to have to
Okay.
leave you. I mean, I would love
Okay.
to go on with this
It's
forever. And
interesting. Thank
I
you for your
haven't even gotten around to trying to sell you some of my Amway
Oh,
products.
I will
I'm
put the
just,
links in the description
just
of your new book coming out and your website. Is that good?
thank you so much. And I
Yeah.
just appreciate this.
Thank you,
So
Raymond. So a
it was
pleasure
just the
meeting you.
greatest fun. But I'm sorry, I
That's
honestly,
okay, honey. All right. Thank you. I'll send this out to you later today.
thank you so much. Hope to talk to you again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.